What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about post-grunge, meaning all the bands of the 90s and 2000s, like Puddle of Mud, Creed, Bush, and Nickelback, all those bands that sound like and if you recoiled in horror at the list of bands that I just rattled off, well, you are not alone, because post-grunge might be the single most hated genre in all of rock. Critics have pretty much universally hated this stuff for decades. Nobody even lists Bush or Seether as like a guilty pleasure. This stuff has essentially zero currency. And yet, at the same time, those bands have sold tens of millions of albums. Somehow, Puddle of Mud still has 3.5 million Spotify listeners. So despite the fact that it may not have very much currency in the larger rock fandom, clearly somebody is listening to this stuff. So what's the deal? Is post-grunge truly terrible? Or is it maybe better than the tastemakers and gatekeepers would care to admit? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. But first, if you haven't, please check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week from 4 to 7 p.m. Pacific on Tuesdays and Thursdays. There's a link to that in the description of this video. But first, I want to thank Native for sponsoring this video. If you use deodorant, and I hope you do, then you should definitely check out Native. They sent me 3 of their new plastic-free deodorants, and I gotta say, I am sincerely, genuinely, really liking this product. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, it is the same formula as their regular deodorant, just in new, much more sustainable packaging. And also the texture. It's not sticky, and it dries very quickly. It's also vegan and cruelty-free, which is very cool. And the ingredients, there's no aluminum or paraben or a lot of those other ingredients that a lot of people like to avoid. You'll see that it's really based on really simple, familiar ingredients like coconut oil, shea butter, tapioca starch, stuff like that. And I honestly like all 3 of these scents, but especially the cucumber and mint one. Very light and fresh, but still gives you 24-hour odor protection. Normally, these 3 plastic-free deodorants would be $39. But if you use my link and coupon code PUNKROCK at checkout, you will get all 3 of them for $26. That is over 33% off. And that is not all. With my code, you can also get 20% off any body wash or toothpaste. So first, let's talk a little bit about what exactly post-grunge is and where it came from, because I think that context is very important. Let's start by talking about grunge itself, which came out in the late 80s and early 90s as a combination of metal, rock, and punk. Like kind of equal parts Black Flag, Black Sabbath, and Led Zeppelin. And as most of you probably know, it was a total shock to the system because it was everything that the music that came before it wasn't. The music was just raw and nasty. It was full of feedback and strained voices and these like incredibly dark lyrics. It was the exact opposite of all the hair metal and polished, glossy pop of the 80s. And the same was true of the way the bands looked and acted. They just got up on stage wearing jeans, flannels, and Converse. Like they just walked up on stage wearing whatever they happened to have on from earlier that day. There was no big hair, or crazy outfits, or big production, or any of that bullshit. Just very real, very raw, stripped down to earth, which is a huge breath of fresh air compared to all those like giant bloated rock star egos of the 80s. And as far as impact goes, as pretty much everybody knows at this point, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains blew up in like 1991, 92, and pretty much completely changed music overnight. All the stories you've heard about how big their impact was, they're true. And personally, I thought it was awesome to see that kind of basically punk ethos and attitude ripple out and start to influence the entire music industry. Which brings us to the dawn of post-grunge. In a way, those bands were almost too influential because within just a few years, you started to see these bands come out that kind of looked and sounded like grunge, but weren't part of the original grunge scene. For example, like Silverchair from Australia, Candlebox, Stone Temple Pilots from California, Collective Soul from Atlanta, Bush from, I guess they're from the UK. This was the beginnings of post-grunge.
Could have been easier on
And these bands had some good songs and they seemed like cool enough people, so I'm not putting them down. But even so, something just kind of felt off. You could tell that really they were emulating Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden more so than doing their own thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we all have influences. But to me, it felt like something was missing. Like these bands didn't really have the same kind of aggressive fuck you stance to the music industry that the original grunge bands did. And I think the fans kind of saw that too. Like the people who were listening to Nirvana in 91 or 92 really mostly wouldn't touch Silverchair or Bush with a 10-foot pole in 1995. It was that clear of a division. And you could kind of see what was going on here, right? Back then, everyone was wondering who was going to be the next Nirvana. And it was pretty obvious that a lot of these bands were signed by labels, hoping that they had found that. And I'm not here to gatekeep what is and isn't like real grunge. First of all, that's like the silliest idea of all time. Second, people should listen to whatever they want. My point is just that there was a very clear difference between that first wave of grunge and the stuff that came even just a few years later. Although I have to say, listening to these bands now, they're kind of better than I gave them credit for. Better than I remember them being, especially Silverchair. Are they as good as Nirvana? No, but who is? Especially considering that I think they were like 16 when their first album came out. In any case, that brings us to what you might call the second wave of post-grunge. And this is where the wheels really started to come off in the later part of the 90s when bands like Creed, Three Doors Down, Hoobastank, Stained, and of course, Nickelback came out. And as much as people hate on Nickelback these days, I actually think of Creed as maybe like the quintessential example of everything wrong with post-grunge. First of all, we gotta talk about Scott Stapp, right? I don't know him personally. I don't know what he's like now. But back then, he really came across as this douchey, self-absorbed cornball kind of guy who was putting on the act of this weird like savior kind of figure and very badly wanted to be worshipped. I mean, you can see in the video for Arms Wide Open, he's like standing up there like he's Jesus, right? Was not even trying to hide it. And you look at that in comparison to Kurt Cobain, who was a very flawed person in lots of ways, but he came across as very genuine, very thoughtful guy, and really almost like he kind of hated being famous. And it was kind of the same story with his vocals. Like Scott Stapp's vocals were almost like a bad imitation of Eddie Vedder. It was like taking what Eddie did and turning them into this cartoonish kind of exaggeration, like if SNL or South Park were making fun of Pearl Jam. And it even comes down to the way they dressed. And is it important how people dress? No, it's not. It doesn't matter what people wear, but it does kind of tell you something about where they're coming from. So when you see Creed walk out in these like leather pants and satin shirts in the video for Higher, it was obvious that Creed was definitely not coming from the same place as Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, even if they kind of superficially sounded a little bit similar. And then after Creed and Nickelback, there was, I guess what you'd call like the third wave of post-grunge with bands like Seether, Shinedown, and 3 Days Grace, which is also when Nickelback really blew up and kind of became the poster children for post-grunge, in the sense of being a band that kind of looks and sounds like a grunge band at first glance, but are very, very clearly not one. And that may sound obvious, but actually, I think the nuances are worth looking at. Their big breakthrough song, How You Remind Me, is really a great example. It's not like you to say sorry. I was waiting on a different story. First of all, let's talk about lyrics. Yes, it does kind of sound like it could be a song by Bush or Candlebox or any of the other kind of grunge-ish bands at first glance, but with one very important difference. This is a love song. Maybe not exactly like a love song, I guess, but kind of your standard rock song about a rocky relationship and whether it can be salvaged and blah, 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 which is not a bad thing at all. But it is very different from the tone and kind of subject matter of most grunge bands, which tended to be about much darker stuff like depression, alienation, and addiction. Like as an example for comparison, take Rooster by Alice in Chains, which I think might be their biggest song and was a certified radio hit. which is kind of crazy to consider what it's actually about, which is his dad fighting in the Vietnam War and all these like really dark, traumatic experiences he had and took home with him. And that song was on an album called Dirt, which is slang for heroin. It had a song called Godsmack, smack being heroin, and that song being about how his addiction was running his life. Like, this is just incredibly dark stuff. That is what grunge brought to the table, for better or worse. And then on the other hand, we have Nickelback with my personal favorite example of just the pure, unadulterated Nickelback cringe, their song SEX. Like, that right there is the difference between grunge and post-grunge in a nutshell. Post-grunge basically appropriated the sonic elements of grunge, like the sort of dark, down-tuned riffs and the yarling vocals, like the rah stuff, and a lot of the aesthetic, like the dudes with the long, greasy hair standing around looking super serious, but without any of the things that actually made grunge fresh, insightful, and important. It was basically like all the style with none of the substance. The guys in the grunge bands were clearly very troubled people in lots of ways. You can say what you want about that, but they were smart. They saw through a lot of the ego-driven, shallow bullshit driving a lot of the music that came before them, and like I said, they legitimately changed music forever. No question. Ever since Nirvana came out, it's been different. Whereas the guys in the post-grunge bands may have looked and sounded kind of similar to the grunge guys, but they were definitely not the same people at all. These were fundamentally different types of humans. The guys in the grunge bands were really more like the new version of hair metal guys. These were not deep thinkers who were like wrestling with the big questions of life. These were just kind of your standard issue rockers who were into partying, getting laid, and being the center of attention. And I don't know anybody in these post-grunge bands personally, and I'm sure some of them are great people, so I'm kind of painting with a broad brush here. But my impression is that basically these bands kind of didn't really have a lot to say. So I think that's kind of the main factor behind why people dislike post-grunge as much as they do. But it wasn't just that. The other thing to consider is that it was just kind of late to the party. Like, grunge came out, made a huge splash, and got commercialized and played out very, very quickly. Like, grunge was kind of over by 96, I would say. So by the time this stuff came out in the late 90s or even early 2000s, it was very, very late to the party, felt very dated. And anybody who was into grunge during the time where it was actually relevant and vital had moved on years ago and wasn't buying any of these post-grunge bands as credible. But like I said earlier, the sort of counterpoint to all of this is that these bands were incredibly popular. Like, probably more popular than almost all the original grunge bands. Creed and Nickelback both went diamond. Three Doors Down have 3 platinum albums, which kind of surprised me. And the list goes on. Like, pretty much all these bands, whatever you think of them, have millions of monthly listeners on Spotify to this day. So clearly they were doing at least something right. Which brings us to the big question. Is this really the worst genre in rock? Well, I think the answer to that largely depends on who you ask and how you look at it. On the one hand, if you're looking at this through the lens of critical acclaim, well, in that case, yes, maybe it is the worst genre in rock. This is kind of like the one genre that pretty much gets zero respect. Like, even ska is more respected than post-grunge. Like, people now maybe kind of admit that the Nickelback hate might have been overblown, and maybe they're not that bad. But do any of these critics and tastemaker, gatekeeper types really truly respect post-grunge? No. Like, is there anyone out there arguing that actually Lifehouse is a really great, important band that we need to pay more attention to? The way they talk up, say, like Refused or At the Drive-In? If they're out there, I would love to find this person, but not that I'm aware of. And I think that part of the reason why the critics hate this stuff so much is a class thing. Because as post-grunge got further away from actual grunge, the audience shifted too. With the original audience for grunge being like art school and college kids who smoked clove cigarettes, like those kind of people. Basically like the early 90s equivalent of hipsters. Whereas with post-grunge, the audience was more of, I guess what you might say is your like Red State Rock Festival kind of audience. Much more of a blue collar kind of audience and much less artsy. Like, really not artsy at all. Like, the post-grunge fan is more like the type of person who lives in Ohio and wears Affliction than the type of person who lives in Portland and wears Doc Martens, right? And as I've talked about before, there is maybe no group of people that the music journalist critic types hate more than those blue-collar Midwestern types of people. And I think, honestly, that has a lot to do with why this genre gets no respect. But with that said, who really gives a shit what critics think, right? Ultimately, what matters matters is what the people think. And like I said, this stuff is super popular, so clearly they've got to be doing something right. So number one, I think at this point, even the strongest post-grunge hater can admit that these bands had some genuinely great songs. Like, yes, obviously Creed is pretty corny, but come on, let's be real, Higher, it's kind of a banger. And yes, Nickelback has extremely cringe lyrics. There are many, many more examples than the one I showed, but honestly, they're pretty damn good songwriters. I also really like that one Lifehouse song. And I kind of love 3 Days Grace, although they are extremely corny. And there's tons more examples. Like, this genre is not short on great songs. But all of that being said, you have to ask the question, does it have the kind of impact and like deep emotional resonance that grunge did? Now that I'm not so sure of. What I mean is this, like even now in 2022, there are 20-year-olds who love Nirvana, who just discovered them 6 months ago and it's now their favorite band, because the emotional chords that they struck were and are just so powerful. Like even 30 years later, Nevermind is just as relevant as it ever was and probably always will be. But can we say the same about Creed, Bush, or Candlebox? Like sure, if you look at the YouTube comments, you'll see people my age getting nostalgic about the time that they played this song in the car on the way home from senior prom or whatever in 1996. But is there anyone out there saying Creed saved my life the way that people said that about Nirvana and Alice in Chains? And are there 20-year-olds discovering Three Doors Down in 2022? And they're like, yeah, this is more like it. I wish they made real music like this these days. I was born in the wrong generation. If there are, I have very serious concerns about this generation, but I'm not so sure that those people are out there. And so to kind of answer the question, is post-grunge great in the same way as grunge was? I would say no, definitely not. But that's also a little bit unfair because grunge was one of the most genuinely important movements in music of like easily the last 50 years, so that's a pretty high bar to clear. On the other end of the spectrum, is post-grunge the most awful shit of all time? Is this like the worst kind of rock ever? Again, I would say no, even if just for the simple fact that it's got a ton of great catchy songs. They may be kind of corny and dated, but they're still great songs that your neighbor's kind of hot 38-year-old rocker wife likes to play on the jukebox at the local like biker bar, and you know, that's got to count for something, right? And if we were to kind of stack rank the various subgenres of rock and metal, it is far from the bottom. It's definitely not as bad as ska or like the swing revival stuff, for example. I'd say that for the most part, nu metal is quite a bit worse than post-grunge as well. Nu metal is like equally corny, but in hindsight, I would say that overall the songs just don't hold up the way that post-grunge does. So all in all, I would say that post-grunge is kind of like the McDonald's of rock. It's definitely not the best, but it's also not the worst. And even though you know it's kind of crappy, sometimes it's just what you want. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, I want to thank everyone who supports on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get my podcasts early, I do giveaways, I do Q&As. There's also a way to have me review your music if that is something you're interested in. All you got to do is join at the $10 and up level. Every month, I do a call for submissions. If you want me to review something, just drop it in the comments of that post, then I will review it live on Twitch and post it on Patreon for everyone to see. So if that sounds cool, just hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.